So kind of thinking forward, what would you want your legacy on the city council to be?
That Seattle becomes finally a city that is at peace with itself. That we become a city that is welcoming to people of all income levels, races, sexual orientations, racial, ethnic backgrounds. That is a city that is full of diversity, that has a working transportation system that increasingly does not depend on the automobile, that has healthy neighborhoods, affordable housing, that grows, that has the capacity to grow and to increase in population, while at the same time preserving and protecting existing neighborhood character and affordable housing, and open space and tree canopy, which we have been losing at a disturbing rate for the last 30 to 35 years. I think, probably the kind of vision that most people have. But I go back to what I said at first: a city that's at peace with itself and is in harmony, and provides the basic amenities that everyone needs to enjoy a quality of life that we all aspire to.
I know housing is a big issue for you, and I'm just curious, with the kind of healthy neighborhoods and affordable housing models, of which there are already some, what do you think are successful in our community now? Do you think there are successful models in the community now? And if not in ours, maybe in other cities?
Well, I like some of the low density. We have a collection of nonprofit housing development corporations in Seattle that is probably a model nationally, and one of them is right here on Capitol Hill, and they do a good job of developing low density townhouse and low rise apartment buildings that fit in well with neighborhoods, conform to existing zoning and so on, and provide affordable places for people to live. And they're dispersed actually pretty widely throughout the city. That is an example of more of which I would like to see. I also have been impressed by the work of the Plymouth Housing Group in terms of its ability to preserve SRO buildings, single room occupancy buildings in downtown Seattle for the long term. And I'm also impressed with the work of the Downtown Emergency Service Center and its ability to acquire, in some cases build, housing that provides long-term, safe, stable, supportive housing for people who have been homeless, people who have particular mental health challenges, developmental challenges, and so on. These are some of the models that I would like to see preserved and increased.
Thank you.
Including the East Lake, the 1811 East Lake project that DSC sponsors.
And you also talked about increasing living wage jobs. Do you have specific recommendations?
I want the city to look seriously at a living wage ordinance. Over 140 cities, and that number is increasing, have passed living wage ordinances in their cities. There are a number of ways to do this, but you begin by doing your best job, which is actually economically not that difficult to determine what it would cost for a family to be able to afford, in terms of income. What would be a living wage in Seattle right now? The estimates that I've heard from people who pay attention to these things is around $16 an hour. Well, we've got an awful lot of jobs in Seattle that pay a lot less than that, and so we'd be setting a standard. To begin with, it may not be that high, but it needs to approach that, and it needs to include affordable health care and take into consideration transportation needs. And the city would set the standard by assuring that all of its employees are compensated in terms of living wages. And the leverage that you can use is with contracting with private contractors, which the city does do, and in return for the contracts over a certain level, it wouldn't be all contracts. You set a dollar amount. Could be 100,000, could be 500,000, something like that. And in return for the contracts, the bidder would be required to pay his or her employees a living wage. You can also do that in terms of some of the permitting that is done for large development projects like the proposed expansion of the convention center. There is leverage that the city can use, and this basically is how most of the cities that have living wage ordinances operate.
I think you may have covered this a little bit in the beginning
Okay.
when you talked about maybe taxing builders differently, that they get so many tax breaks already, developers. But do you have other ideas for how you might solve the budget woes that don't appear to be going away anytime soon?
There are a couple of management things that could be done. I have some friends who are pretty good at scrutinizing the city's budget, and I would rely on some of their wisdom. We probably have departments in city government that are management heavy, and there's a kind of compression that probably needs to occur in a number of areas where there are fewer managers per employee. And this would require a top-to-bottom analysis of how the management system works. The other would be a serious consideration of zero-based budgeting, which I'm not sure the city's ever gone through such an exercise, which you basically start out with a fresh sheet rather than building on budgets from the past. Having worked with nonprofit organizations for some 35 years, I know what happens in organizational budgets. There becomes a kind of momentum in your budgeting. He says, well, we've already done this, therefore we're going to continue to fund it. I think those kinds of efficiencies I think could be really helpful. And there are more tax breaks that I think we give away and incentives to private business that is probably necessary. We need to analyze that as well.
In your questionnaire, you talked a little bit about advocating perhaps for a state income tax and looking at issues at the state level, and I was wondering if you could maybe speak just a little bit more about that. I know we're getting close on time. So.
Yeah. Well, Lisa Brown finally, I think, stepped forward in the last session of the legislature and as a leader really began to talk about it seriously. I think that our politicians are too afraid to take on our state policy, to take on the income tax issue, I think unnecessarily. I think if the voters are educated and really understand that we have one of the most repressive state tax systems in the country, and that it's really harming working people and middle class people, disproportionate. They pay a disproportionate amount of their incomes for taxes. There is a public education process that needs to go forward. And I also think that if we could get officials in municipalities and counties around the country to come together on this issue and really educate our state legislators, there is at least a possibility that we could move in this direction. As I understand it, we are one of only 7 states that does not have a state income tax. And I know that there are budget crises across the board, but at least part of what we could do is we could make our tax system more progressive and more equitable, particularly in terms of middle and low income people.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.